To counter Ryzeal, you have to counter Detonator by negating it but keeping it on the field or returning it to the deck so that they can't reborn it with plug-in. So a good card to use would be Ultimate Slayer to shuffle it back to the deck, or Forbidden Droplet to negate it but it stays on the field. Imperm doesn't work because it'll chain destroy itself then revive itself with plug-in. Or use Metal Tronus to banish it face down. Or just use Druisworm. Banish anything from grave then crash. Druisworm to send Detonator to grave. They can still revive with plug-in, but if you play Druisworm this should be your ideal play. These are generally the 4 best counters. Other than that, use Infinite Impermanence on Duo Drive, use Ash Blossom and Valor on Ice if they started with it, because if you wait, they'll negate them with Cross, use Purge on Duo Drive, and use Impulse on Ice trying to summon from deck. Droll is sometimes good, especially if they started with 7th Ascension or Tachyon. Nibiru isn't very good because they negate it with Cross, however the deck can struggle against board breakers since it has no spell negates. To counter Maliss, you must use both hand traps that prevent banishing, so Lancea which completely stops their turn, or Chaos Hunter which does require a discard, but they can't use Call by the Grave on it. Other than that, for high risk high reward, use Ash Blossom and Impulse on White Binder. For a safer play just use Ash on one of their traps if they start with White Rabbit. Use Imperm on their normal summon, and hope they don't have extenders, if they do have extenders then one Imperm isn't enough, use Ghost Bell on GWC. Ghost Ogre is bad against Maliss but try to use it on Rabbit and hope they have no follow-up. Unfortunately both Droll and Nibiru are bad against this deck. Board breakers aren't always good because they can negate them with cards like Disave Worm. Against Crystron, use Ash Blossom on Tristato's Grave effect to prevent summoning 3 cards. Use Imperm and Valor on Sulfador since this card generates them the most advantage. The Lancea that you're using against Maliss is also good against Crystron. Use Impulse also on Sulfador if you see they have no other way of summoning it. Use Ghost Ogre on Tristaros when it tries to summon from deck. Both Nibiru and Droll are very good against Crystron, but it doesn't lose to board breakers due to all the spell and trap negates that they have. Against Mermail, use Ash Blossom and Impulse on Shadow Squad or on Abyss Rhine, whichever they activate first. Other than that, this deck is very resilient to hand traps. You can try to use Imperm on Bahamut Shark so they can't extend as much. You can try to get rid of Prince before it activates since that card sends for cost. Droll is probably your best hand trap to play against Mermail. Nibiru isn't usually very good because they'll snipe it off your hand with Minstrel, and you won't have a hand by the time it's your turn to use your board breakers. You'll have discarded all of them. If you just have Ash Blossom, use it on Wishes. If you only have Imperm, use it on Spirit the Link one, even if it's at risk of being negated by Drill Beam. Ghost Ogre should ideally be used on True Light, which basically negates it when wipes your opponent's field. Bestial can be used to banish anything from their grave like Maiden, but it'll depend on how they started their combo. Impulse can also be used on Spirit, while Purge should be used either on Lordly Load if you don't have Ash for it, or on Wishes if they never activated Lordly Load. Nibiru is great against this deck because they often can't use monster effects to negate it because of Lordly Load. Droll is sometimes good depending on if they started with Primate or not, and the deck doesn't lose to board breakers because of cards like Ultimate Spirit and Drill Beam which can negate them. Against Snake Eyes Fiendsmith, which is popular with the Millennium Engine these days, use Ash Blossom and Impulse on Original Sinful Spoils if they started with Diabelster, or use it on Snake Eyes Ash's second effect if they started with that, or use Ash on Zombie Vampire if they started with the Millennium Engine, so it all depends on what they started their combo with. Use Imperm on Snake Eye Ash regardless of what they start with. Also use Ogre on Senjinjin. Bestials can be used on Masquerina in their grave when they try to place it on their field. Purge should also be used on Snake Eye Ash. The deck might struggle against Nibiru but only depending on how they start their combo. Droll is not always useful, because they can do full Snake Eyes combo under Droll. The deck doesn't lose to board breakers because they usually have Desiree. Against Memento, you want to use Ash Blossom on Horse if they summoned it early, or use it on Twin Dragon if they summon that first. Imperm should also be used either on Horse or Twin Dragon whichever they summon first. Ghost Ogre should also be used on Horse. Bestials are great against Gaddock to prevent both the summon and the recovery. Use Purge on Twin Dragon. and use Impulse on Memento Fusion or on Sleepy's Fusion effect, whatever they activate first. Duel is not the best against Memento because they usually add from grave to hand instead of deck. Nibiru is usually good against Memento if they're not playing Fiendsmith with it, especially because Appaloosa is usually summoned on your turn instead of theirs, and the deck does lose to board breakers if they're not playing Desiree. Against Tenpai, they'll use their board breakers to wipe your field and you're just left with hand traps, so you want to use Ash and Imperm on Pydra, or Ash on Jinroku if they started with that, or Ash Kaimin if that's what they started with. Ghost Ogre is good against the field spell. Purge is also good against Pydra or Kaimin, while Impulse on Jinroku or Kaimin, whatever they use first. Nibiru is useless. Duel isn't very good because they sometimes only need to search once to OTK. There goes second deck, so board breakers are also useless. If you're playing against White Forest, use Ash, Imperm, and Impulse on a Stellar if they started with that. If they start with Sylvie, use Imperm on it as well since the Synchros can just avoid being targeted. Ash is also good on LZ if they start with that. Ghost Ogre should be used on Deception. Bestial is good against whatever they're trying to summon from grave. Purge can be used on Ryzeal if they can't chain block, or on Sylvie if you see that they can chain block Ryzeal. Nibiru isn't usually good against White Forest because they can get an early negate, or just play after Nibiru. Duel is great against White Forest because they do search a lot, and the deck doesn't lose to board breakers because they usually have multiple Omni negates. Next we have Yubel Fiendsmith. Always use your Ash Blossom on D-Lotus. However, if they start with Engraver, you have to use Ash on Tract, otherwise they can negate Ash. Imperm should also be used on D-Lotus as soon as they summon it, since they have less ways of playing through that than playing through a negated Spirit of Yubel. However, if they started with Fiendsmith, use Imperm on Sequence. Ghost Ogre should ideally be used Nightmare Pain. For Bestials, use them either on Lurie if you can, or Engraver if you couldn't use it on Lurie. If they didn't start with Fiendsmith, then you can use it to prevent them summoning Spirit of Yubel or D-Lotus from grave. Duel is usually good against this deck depending on their hand. Nibiru is useless since they can either force it with the Fiendsmith engine or negate it with Phantom of Yubel, and they may have multiple Omni negates with Desiree or Varudras so they don't lose to board breakers. Against Branded, always save Impulse and Ash Blossom for Branded Fusion no matter how many cards they activate before that. Imperm and Purge can be used on Alubra to prevent searching Branded Fusion. Bestials are great to banish Fallen of Albaz after they activate Branded Fusion to mess up their fusion target. Nibiru isn't very good because of all the end phase activations. Duel isn't very good because they can add Branded Fusion from grave to hand, and the deck doesn't lose to board breakers, because Light and Darkness just has 3 Omni negates. If you're playing against Centurion, always use Imperm on Oxalate to prevent both its effects. You can also Imperm True Dea but only if they normal summoned it. Ash can be used on Primera simply for the lack of a better target. Use Impulse on Primera or True Dea when they're trying to summon from back row, and use Purge on Oxala. Or if you see they can't chain block it, just use Purge on Primera. The deck does struggle against Nibiru after the new support. However, they do have good plays under Duel, and it doesn't lose to board breakers because they have multiple Omni negates. Against Kashtira, use Ash Blossom and Impulse on Theosis. As for Imperm, save it for a Rise Hard on your own turn which can just win you the game. Ghost Ogre and Bestials aren't very good against Kashtira unfortunately. Use Purge on Unicorn. Nibiru isn't very because they can make a Rise Heart in 4 summons. Duel also isn't very good because every searchable card they already play at 3. And the deck does lose to board breakers due to no Omni negates. If you're playing against Chimera Azamina Fiendsmith, use Ash Blossom on their starter, so Ash Sword Knight if they started with that, or Gazelle if they normal summoned it, or if they started with Apprentice, or Tract if they started with Engraver, or Deception if they started with their Azamina engine. As for Imperm, use it on the Fusion Baphomet if they don't have Codal Engrave. If they do have Codal, then use Imperm more early on Gazelle. Ogre is ideally used on Deception. Use Bestials on whatever Baphomet sends from deck to grave. This deck searches a lot so it will struggle against Duel. Nibiru isn't very good because they have 2 engines that negate or force Nibiru early, and they can get an Omni negate or 2 to negate your board breakers. To counter Spright, try to focus on Gigantic Spright, so if they summon it early, use any hand trap on it. However, you have to use Ash, and Perm, and Valor on Spright Blue, otherwise they can search Red or Carrot to negate your hand trap. Also use Ghost Ogre on Gigantic since it detaches for resolution. Use Impulse on Gigantic as well. Use Purge on Spright Blue or Jet, whichever they activate first. The deck doesn't mind Droll since they just special summon from deck a lot. Nibiru isn't very good since Gigantic locks the player and the opponent into level 2 or lower, so you won't be able to activate it, and Spright is usually able to negate board breakers with Carrot if needed. Shout out to these amazing people for the great support. Click the link in description to become a member.